how do I convince my management to adopt OKRs? This is really hard. And the reason is because managers have a habit of deciding things for themselves. In some ways, that's how they got there, and that's what their job is. And so it can be really hard to convince people to do this. If you want to do it, you can try, and often you'll succeed. Sometimes you won't. So I recommend trying to make sure that you're happy in your situation, even if your managers say no to something like this, or change your situation, like go to another organization where there is that desire. However, how do I convince? Let's say that this is something you want to do, and your management's somewhat open-minded to it. How do you convince them? There are two basic ways I think that happen here. One way is the way that is the obvious way, but it's a bit harder. But it's hard. It's always harder, but when it works really well. And that's convince your management to do it, right? So just if you can talk to them about OKRs and say, hey, this is great, this is a really useful technique. Here's why. Show them the books and whatever it is. What it really depends on is understanding them and their needs and what problems they're trying to solve, and then presenting how OKRs solve the problems that they have. Like if you should tell them, if you would talk to your management and say, we should use OKRs because Google use OKRs and Google's very successful. It doesn't fly very well and it's not very compelling. It doesn't make a difference. What matters is when managers are struggling with some particular issue, some thing that they're trying to do, they're bothered by the fact that everyone's not aligned, or that there's not enough focus, or that people don't seem to be engaged in understanding how their work relates to the delivery, or they're frustrated by the pace of execution, and you think that maybe this is to do with focus and to do with too many different things and different changing priorities. That kind of thing, if they have those kinds of problems, then OKRs are actually a great solution to those problems. And you can present OKRs, here is a potential solution to these problems. And if they can do it, the reason this works well is if they decide to do it, the best way to implement OKRs in an organization is to start at the top, right? Start at that top level and start there and then roll it down. When you go for a subset like your team, it can work really well. It's not bad, but that getting from there to go up the organization is still hard, and it's still very hard to do that unless it's run as a conscious pilot. So which brings us to the second method, which is to do it yourself. Oh, I'll go back to the first bit. The other thing, by the way, when you're suggesting anything, this is a top tip for convincing management about anything at all, right? Make sure you're satisfying them on the things that they think are important first. I had this experience once where I was working at Google. So actually my first management job. And I made the mistake of trying to change my manager's mind on a bunch of things that I thought were really important that he didn't, while also not yet delivering what he thought was really important for me. And because I was new to the organization, and in fact, I thought that those things weren't important, that these things were, we should do those things instead. So I wasn't delivering the metrics and the improvements to the particular metrics he thought were important. With hindsight, I think he was actually right in most cases, although I also think that I did have a point, and that was a good point. However, my purpose of this statement is that unless you're delivering what your manager is looking for, then they're not usually interested in your ideas. And may seem unfair and harsh, but it is what it is. So make sure you're delivering whatever it is that they're looking for. Then they'll be very interested in your ideas, and they'll have patience and interest to hear your ideas. So that's my top tip for that. Do that anyway. So that's especially if you're convincing them to do it. Now, if you can't convince them to do it, you don't want to go directly to them. The other way to do this is to implement it yourself. However, here's the big but with this problem, this situation here. If you set OKRs and you're using OKRs as the way I like to use them, which is like a directional tool, like here's how we're going about, here's what we're trying to achieve. You've got to be very careful about how they're interpreted as expectation management, right? Because you'll have stakeholders and managers, and this is actually very related to the point I just made about keeping a manager happy. Whatever you're doing, you need to be managing their expectations consciously and telling them, making sure that they know what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, and what to expect, what not to expect. So make sure that you're communicating very clearly about this is the expectation you should have. Now, if you're going to use OKRs with ambition, like with stretch goals for your team, because it's going to inspire your team, you're going to have a stretch goal that we might get to 70% of that goal, and that'd be great. And if we get to 100%, it'd be amazing. And you tell people that you're going to, like let's suppose it's improving the page load speed from 2 seconds to 1 second, and your team says, "Oh, that's pretty tight. I don't know whether that's theoretically possible, but it's really, really tough." And you think that's a great stretch goal. Like, let's do that as a stretch goal. And they say, yes, let's do it as a stretch goal. But then you tell your managers and your stakeholders that you have a goal to get to 1 second. They'll see that as a baseline or a commitment. Unless you have a great relationship with them and they really do understand this idea of stretch goals and ambition and are comfortable with that, are really comfortable with that, and you manage that carefully, you'll just end up them being excited about the goal, which is great because you'll feel good, but then so disappointed when you only get to 1.2 instead of 1. Whereas your team will be super proud that they got to 1.2. So that's a disaster when that happens, because you've set the wrong expectations. People are then disappointed, and then they think, well, that's why OKRs don't work, which isn't a big problem. But more importantly, they say that's why you're not a very good leader, right? And now you're kind of on a performance improvement program or whatever it is you do. You're in the doghouse. So don't do that. So make sure you're being really clear about what expectations to set. I recommend setting only non-stretch goals, like confident goals, or at least setting 2 sets of OKRs, the same thing. Here are the ones that I'll use to set expectations that are not stretch goals, that are confident. And here are the ones that I'm using to set targets for my team, which are stretch goals. So that's one way of doing it, that you can do it. But then you just make sure you never communicate the stretch goals outside. Make sure your team all understand that these are the internal stretch goals, but this is what we're managing expectations with. And so that can go and get the best of both worlds. So then you can do that. What's happening now is you're delivering OKRs, you're working with OKRs, and if you're able to deliver good results, like if you occasionally do go past one of those committed goals, then you hit your stretch goal, you get close to your stretch goal. People, well, how did you do that? That's really good. That seems to be going really well. We've got good results from this team. We've got focus on this team. This team is able to say no. And this is the other thing, is when you're working with expectation management, using OKRs for expectation management is super useful, because you can say, here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's the goal we're going towards, the direction we're going towards, and that's why we're not doing those things. They come up with another idea. So, no, we're not doing that because we're doing these things, right? So it's actually quite a good tool for managing expectations, as long as you're clear about what you're actually doing and what you're not doing, right? So what's a stretch goal and what's not? So be careful about stretch goals. And so I'm going off on a tangent here. do run OKRs in your team, make sure it works really well. And by setting that example, by being able to manage expectations, by being able to talk about, here are the things we're working on, these are the objectives that we have, and these are the key results. Our definition of success is at these key results. People will understand that. They don't need to understand OKRs. It's nothing magical here. They'll understand that, and they'll think, oh, that's actually quite good. You've got a really clear set of directions, and your team sees you're executing well, and then they start to be interested in using OKRs. And so a lot of organizations will start OKRs in one subset, one group, because of exactly that reason. But then it has to perform, and then I'll stretch it out. If your management's not interested in OKRs, you just start doing them and start using them as part of your mechanism for communicating about expectations. Be careful about stretch goals, but you'll be fine.